Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video of History Valley Podcast. Today I'm live with Professor Yonatan Adler, and we're talking about his book, The Origins of Judaism, an Archaeological Historical Reappraisal. For those that are unfamiliar with him, Professor Yonatan Adler is an associate professor in archaeology at Ariel University in Israel, where he also heads the Institute of Archaeology. In 2019 to 2020, he held the appointment of Horace W. Goldsmith, visiting associate professor in Judaic studies at Yale University. Adler specializes in the origins of Judaism as a system of ritual practices and in the evolution of these practices over the long term. His research in recent years has focused on ritual purity observance evidenced in the archaeological remains of chalk vessels and immersion pools. He has also researched and published extensively on ancient Teflon phylacteries from Qumran and elsewhere in the Judean desert. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Adler.
Thanks so much for having me, Jacob.
Well, I want to kick off with this question. When you're saying that you're reappraising the archaeology in Israel, what are the implications of that? What led you to that route? What led you down that path?
Okay, so the title of the book is The Origins of Judaism, an Archaeological Historical Reappraisal. And what I'm doing in the book is looking at the question of when Judaism begins, when Judaism first emerges on the stage of history. Now, we need to begin with definitions. When I say Judaism, what exactly is it that I'm referring to? So I'm not going to define what Judaism is, but what I would like to do is define what Judaism is for me for the purposes of this book. What I'm looking at is the question of from which period of time did the Judeans, the ancestors of today's Jews, first begin to keep the laws of the Torah in daily life? So the question is Judeans as a society. I'm not looking at, so off the bat, right? I want to already say, I'm not looking at the question of from when do we have the Torah? From when does the Torah exist as a book? Because this could go back far earlier than the period of time when Judeans as a society know of this Torah, right? So I think we can assume that the Torah was written down, edited, and so on and so forth way earlier, or at least earlier, let's put it that way, earlier than when Judeans at large came to know of this Torah, to regard it as authoritative and to put it into practice. So the question that I'm looking at in the book is, when did Judeans as a society, ordinary Judeans, your farmers, your craftsmen, your homemakers, ordinary people, when did they come to know about the Torah and put it into practice? That's the question that I'm asking in this book.
What would you say is the earliest evidence that we have that attests to the existence of the earliest evidence for Jewish practices, basically?
Okay, so precisely that's the question that I'm asking. And I'll get to the answer to that question. But first, I'd like to explain what my methodology is. So the methodology is actually quite straightforward. I start from a period of time when we know that this thing that I'm calling Judaism existed. A period of time when we have ample evidence that ancient Jews, let's call them for our purposes Judeans, knew of the laws of the Torah and were keeping it. And throughout the book, I show that in the first century of the Common Era, we have a plethora of evidence, both textual and archaeological, which indicate that that ordinary Judeans knew about the rules of the Torah and were keeping them. I don't know if I would say universally, but certainly in a very, very widespread manner. So, chapter after chapter, I show the various practices, things like the Sabbath prohibitions, fasting on the Day of Atonement, on Yom Kippur, the laws of Passover, right? Refraining from eating leaven, eating unleavened bread, the dietary laws, right? Refraining from eating things like pig and scaleless and finless fish. The purity laws, the figural art. These are all practices and prohibitions which we have ample evidence of in the first century of the Common Era that Judeans are practicing. What I then do is then I look backwards in time. I go backwards to the first century before the Common Era, to the second century before the Common Era, to the third century before the Common Era, looking for evidence that ordinary Judeans were keeping these rules. And what I find, and this is where I'm getting to the cutting to the chase to answer your question, what I find throughout the book is that the trail of evidence ends invariably in the middle of the second century before the Common Era. So the middle of the second century before the Common Era, this is the Hasmonean period, the period when Judea is ruled by an independent Judean family called the Hasmoneans after the Maccabean revolt. It's at this time that we have the first evidence that ordinary Judeans are keeping the rules of the Torah on a wide-scale basis.
Would it be fair to say, from the evidence that you've examined, that Judaism and its religious practices developed in stages over time?
Okay, so when we're dealing with archaeological time, when we're dealing in the ancient past, I think it's important to remember that our scale is a bit different than what we think of today, right? So for us today, if we were to talk about some phenomenon developing over the course of 50 years, right? That's a long time, right? What was 50 years ago today? Today we're in 2023, so 50 years ago was 1973. That was a long time ago. So think of some kind of cultural phenomenon that developed over the course of the last 50 years. We would think of that as a long time. In archaeological terms, that wouldn't be considered a long time. So I'm using quite a broad brush when I speak of the middle of the second century before the Common Era, right? The middle of the second century before the Common Era is the course of a couple of decades. The earliest evidence that we have comes from around that period of time. Now, what I do in the book, and I'm very, very careful about my analysis of the data here, the fact that the earliest evidence that we have that has survived comes from the middle of the second century before the Common Era is a fact. If you'd like to debate me on that, you can do that. You can debate me and you can bring me evidence that comes from an earlier period of time. I don't know of any earlier evidence. If one of our listeners, someone watching out there, knows of evidence which predates the second century before the Common Era, please let me know. As far as my research has shown, there is no surviving evidence. Now, tomorrow we might find new evidence. That's always possible. But to date, there is no surviving evidence known which predates the middle of the second century before the Common Era. What does that tell us? That doesn't mean that Judaism emerged in the middle of the second century before the Common Era necessarily. What it means is that we have a terminus ante quem. That means that Judaism must have emerged, must have appeared then, in the middle of the second century before the Common Era, or earlier. Because it's always possible that evidence hasn't survived, that the evidence is there, people were keeping the rules on a wide-scale basis, but the evidence simply hasn't survived. That's always a possibility. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That's something which is very important to remember. So what I'm able to do is determine very clearly a terminus ante quem. What I do in the last chapter is I look beyond that terminus ante quem. I look in periods prior to the second century before the Common Era to look for more contextual evidence, more, I would say, evidence which deals with the Sitzenleben, the place within which Judeans were living. Place, I mean, in terms of time and in terms of surroundings and circumstances, to search for what makes the most sense in terms of seeking the beginnings of Judaism. So in other words, by definition, prior to our Terminus Antiquem, we have zero evidence, zero surviving evidence that Judeans are keeping the rules. But possibly that evidence hasn't survived, and therefore we should look at circumstantial evidence to see, okay, what was going on at the time? What do we know that Judeans were doing? And does that look like anything like what we would imagine Judaism would look like? So I assume that we'll get into the details a little bit more as we discuss this, but basically that's the overall outline of the book. I have a data-driven analysis in the first 6 chapters, right, where I look at practice after practice. I start with the first century of the Common Era, go backwards in time, showing that the trail of evidence ends in the middle of the 2nd century BCE. And then in the last chapter, I look at circumstantial evidence before the 2nd century BCE to see, to try to conjecture essentially when Judaism must have emerged and why. That's the basic outline of the book.
I remember that you mentioned in the book that you think it's possible that there might have been a proto-Pentateuch, as you call it. And I want to ask, in relation to that question, to that possibility, because I know you bring up Hilkiah, you bring up Ezra. We both know that in the Old Testament, Hilkiah supposedly discovered some kind of law code during a renovation of the first temple. And then later on, supposedly, Ezra released copies of his law. And what I want to ask you about is, how reliable do you think those accounts are? And could the hypothetical proto-Pentateuch, in your opinion, be possibly connected to either one of those accounts? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so number one, I want to make very clear that in my book, I distinguish between what I call intellectual history and social history. Intellectual history is what biblical scholars usually spend most of their time doing. Okay, biblical scholars are super interested in the ideas that we find in biblical literature. You used the word reliable, okay? We need to be very careful when we're speaking about any writings, historical writings, ancient writings, certainly, what kind of evidence we can expect to be able to extract from writings, from texts. Texts, and biblical texts included, are a wonderful source of historical data if our interest is in the history of ideas, if our interest is in intellectual history. What do I mean by that? If we read a biblical text, it doesn't matter what biblical text we're talking about. It could be Genesis, it could be Proverbs, it could be Song of Songs, it doesn't matter. Or the New Testament for that matter, the gospel text, whatever. A text written by a human being in the past. This is a wonderful source of historical information about the ideas that were in the writer's mind that writer wanted to express in words, right? So if we can figure out when this writer lived, we have wonderful information about a single writer for any particular text writing at that particular point in time. And we have a notion of the ideas that were in that person's mind that he or she possibly wanted to express in literature. That's great if we're interested in the history of ideas. If we're interested in social history, in other words, in what the people surrounding this writer were thinking, were doing, if we're interested in political history and in any kind of economic history, any other kind of history aside from the history of ideas, then we run into some trouble, right? Because the biblical texts, again, any text that's written by human beings in the past, in other words, before right now, which is all the texts that we have, they're penned by human beings who are subjective. So they have, first of all, everything that they are writing comes through their brains, which experience the world through their ears and their eyes and all of their senses, right? These are texts which are written by humans who are subjective. And therefore, to try to decipher from them what was actually going on, we need to be very careful. There's no such thing as a reliable text, period, full stop, right? We don't use, I don't like to use the term reliable when we're talking about history, right? When we're talking about relying on, some textual source, whatever that textual source is. I don't think that that's an appropriate term. I think that these texts are excellent sources for intellectual history. So that was all an introduction to answer your question. In terms of Pentateuch, Proto-Pentateuch, and so on and so forth, I might have mentioned this in the book, but I don't get into this because I'm not doing intellectual history. I'm doing social history. What interests me, and this is perhaps what sets my book apart from what biblical scholars generally do, I'm interested in what the ordinary people are doing. I'm not interested in terms of, as far as the book is concerned, I'm not interested in the biblical writers as such. I'm not interested in what they're thinking people should be doing, what they're telling us people were doing. That doesn't interest me in this book. What interests me is what people were actually doing. When were Judeans actually keeping the laws of the Torah? Now, we have the stories that you mentioned in terms of Josiah, Ezra, Hezekiah, also, discovering laws that are in the Torah and promulgating them and so on and so forth. These are stories that the biblical writers tell us. And from these stories, we can learn that the writers of these texts clearly thought that the Torah was something important, something which Judeans should be keeping. Absolutely. And that's important. But for my purposes, it's not particularly important because my question is, were the Judeans actually aware of this Torah? Were they putting it into practice? And the stories themselves cannot really tell us that.
We've got a super chat question. Michael Apple, thank you for your super chat. Given Dr. Adler's research, give some differences between Jewish worship in Judea, late Second Temple, and the diaspora. Are there real differences in the social history?
Okay, that's an excellent question, Michael. So it's a little bit hard to say because our data is not so, I would say it's not so thick in terms of differences. There's little doubt that there would have been differences. It makes sense that there would be differences between different geographical areas. We have evidence that Judeans in the diaspora are keeping things like Shabbat, are refraining from eating pig. So, for example, Jews in Egypt, Judeans in Egypt, we are told that they refrain from eating pig. We have synagogues in Egypt where Judeans are gathering once a week to hear the Torah being read. And we also find in the New Testament, especially in Acts, stories about synagogues in the diaspora, especially in the area of Asia Minor, Turkey of today, where the Torah was being read on a weekly basis before, again, ordinary people. So whereas most people probably would have been illiterate, all you needed is for one person in the community to know how to read and for there to be one scroll of the Torah in that community and a building where people could gather once a week, and you would have the Torah being spread. So to the degree that the Torah was the same in all these different places, and I think there's good reason to think that was the case, it would make sense that more or less you would have more or less the same observances. When I say more or less, that means, so, people are observing prohibitions on the Sabbath. Exactly what those prohibitions were, doubtless there would have been disagreements about. But the fact that they're observing some kind of prohibitions on Sabbath is clear. The same as far as, abstaining from the things that are prohibited in the Pentateuch. There probably were differences in how exactly this was interpreted, but the basic rules, I think, were probably kept both in the diaspora and in Judea.
I want to discuss the Elephantine papyri for a moment. Is it really early evidence of the Passover being practiced or something similar to it? Because I know you talk about that as well a little bit.
Sure.
Just want to get your quick thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the Elephantine papyri are super important for understanding Judean society in, let's say, the 5th century before the Common Era. That's when these date to. Some of them have actually excellent dates in the documents themselves. These come from, just for the listeners who perhaps aren't familiar, Elephantine is an island in southern Egypt, so it's called Upper Egypt, Upper Nile, near Aswan of today. And there was a Judean settlement, so a settlement of Judeans, self-identifying as Judeans, living on this island in the Nile River in the 5th century before the Common Era, so the 400s before the Common Era. And because this is Egypt, it's an arid country, we have preserved papyri, which usually wouldn't have been preserved under normal circumstances. Because it's such a dry area, these have been preserved. We also have ostraca. These are documents written on broken pottery shards, which also have been found. And not all of them belong to Judeans, but a large collection do belong to Judeans. And what we find is that there's no evidence in these documents that the Judeans living in the 5th century before the Common Era knew anything of the Torah. Okay, and the one document which scholars tend to cite that seems to have something to do with the Torah is the so-called Passover letter. This is a letter which speaks about something happening on the 14th day of a certain month. And from the back of the papyrus, it seems, the continuation of the letter, it seems that that month is probably Nisan, which is the first month of the year. And something happening for 7 days between the 15th and the 21st of this month, which seems to coincide with the festival of unleavened bread. And supposedly, the letter also talks about eating Passover sacrifice and refraining from eating leaven, eating unleavened bread, purifying before this holiday, and so on and so forth. This sounds a lot like a Passover and the festival of unleavened bread that we find in the Pentateuch. What I show in the book is a major problem with this understanding is that all of the parts of the letter which speak about Passover, eating unleavened bread, and so on and so forth, all the stuff that really looks like what we find in the Pentateuch is all reconstructed, right? So this papyrus is extremely fragmentary. There's only the upper part of it and the left-hand part of it has survived. The right-hand part on the front of the papyrus is almost completely missing. And it's there in that missing part that we have all the stuff that's really parallel to Passover. Now, to do that, right, to say, okay, so we're going to reconstruct this letter and then use it as evidence that Judeans were keeping the rules of the Torah is what we call, in logic, circular reasoning, right? And just in case the listeners here aren't aware of this, circular reasoning is bad. right? We try to avoid circular reasoning because it's bad reasoning. So I'm not saying that we can't try to reconstruct this letter. It's fine to try to reconstruct the letter. But if we assume that the writers of the letter knew about the Torah and reconstruct the letter on that basis, we can't go then 180 degrees and reason, okay, they must have known about the Torah because here, it talks all about Passover just like it says in the Pentateuch. So the so-called Passover letter is actually nothing of the sort. It's not a letter which speaks about Passover. The one word in this letter which has been preserved, which scholars think has something to do with the festival of unleavened bread, is the word in Aramaic chamir. And the word chamir, scholars have translated this to mean leaven, right? But in actuality, it means fermented. And that line, the preserved line, speaks about drinking something, and anything which is fermented, which is hamir, right? So in later Aramaic, the word hamir has come to be used for fermented dough, which is leaven. But because the line is speaking about drinking or not drinking, I think the most straightforward translation would be fermented. Either drink something fermented, don't drink something fermented. The Pentateuchal rules about the festival of unleavened bread, Passover, say nothing about drinking anything. There's nothing to drink or not to drink, nothing about any fermented drink. So the connection to Passover or to the festival of unleavened bread at most has something to do with the dates. So if indeed the dates are from the 15th until the 21st of the month of Nisan, then we would have a parallel in terms of the festival that we find in the Pentateuch. That's not a reason to assume that the writer of this letter knew about the Pentateuch.
Assuming that the Pentateuch did exist earlier, and I know that in the book you're not specifically taking a position on when it dates, but if you had to lean a certain direction, when do you think the Pentateuch was circulating alongside these early Jewish practices?
So again, if the question is when did it exist, and you were to ask me, when was Pentateuch written, when was it edited, and you were to ask me if I had to, lean in one direction or another, I would say, what's forcing me to lean in one direction or another? I don't know. I know that scholars have been debating this for, 200 years or so. And I think the evidence that we have, that I've seen, is not very good. So it's really, really hard to stake a claim, in any particular century when the Pentateuch came to be, the various parts of the Pentateuch, let's say, came to be written down, when they came to be edited. Super complicated subject, and the jury is still out on this. So I'm certainly not going to weigh in on this question. And as I said in the book, I don't weigh in on this question because as far as I'm concerned, the Pentateuch could be much older than the Hasmonean period, when the earliest evidence we have for the widespread observance of this Pentateuch first appears. So these are two really, really different things. And I simply don't touch on the question of when the Pentateuch or its sources were written down, edited, and so on and so forth. I think it's important to understand and to recognize this for your audience. I assume that there are a lot of non-specialists, but specialists also, I think, oftentimes forget this. For us, the biblical texts are the Bible, right? These are important texts for, let's say, Western civilization, right? And they have been for quite some time. What we forget oftentimes, and I think biblical scholars are guilty of this just as much as laymen, what we forget is that when these texts were first written, we have little reason to think that ordinary people knew about them or cared about them, right? The authors of these texts, biblical scholars often speak of the authors of these texts as elites, right? Societal elites. If you look in the dictionary, the English dictionary, the term elite assumes or suggests that these people have some kind of influence on society. And I have little reason to think that the biblical authors were elites. Certainly, they were highly intelligent people. These were intellectuals. These were people that were highly literate and capable of penning extraordinarily complex literature, right? Absolutely. That doesn't make them elites. That doesn't make them at all influential. So we have to remember this when we're thinking about these biblical texts, that after they were written, they might have been not even circulating at all, right? These texts, or at least some of them, might have been sitting on a shelf somewhere, gathering dust. That's certainly a possibility. Another possibility is that they were being circulated amongst a very small cadre of other intellectuals, right? Scribes and so forth, who were not, again, not elites. And I can imagine, it's very easy to imagine a small circle of pietists, of scribes that are passing these texts around amongst themselves. But we're talking about or we could be, right? Potentially, we could be speaking about a very small group of individuals that are that know about these texts and are regarding them as important in any sort of way. That's a possibility which we need to keep in mind. And what I'm looking at in the book is, okay, what evidence, when do we have evidence that the Pentateuch went beyond this small group of people, if there was such a group of people? When do we have evidence that the masses, the ordinary people, the rank and file Judeans as a society came to know about the Pentateuch and to regard this as a text which is authoritative and which they need to put into practice? Eventually this happened, right? When we get to the first century of the Common Era, that for sure, that is the case. And what I show in the book is that this actually, the earliest evidence we have for this is in the Hasmonean period, in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era.
From the archaeological evidence that you've seen, when do you see the earliest evidence of monotheism having occurred with certainty, in contrast to polytheism? And even when monotheism started emerging, where there's still a lot of Jews, from what you can tell, a lot of Jews of that time practicing the worship of more than one deity.
Okay, so one of the things that I show in the book, in the last chapter that I mentioned, that where I look beyond the terminus antiquem that I had established in the 2nd century before the Common Era, I look at the Persian period. Okay, so we're talking about, let's say, the late 6th century until the late 4th century before the Common Era. This is a period of time where we have evidence. You mentioned Elephantine. We have evidence from Judea. We also have evidence from Babylonia. These are the 3 geographical locations where we have surviving evidence of Judeans living during this Persian period. And actually, at each of these locations, we have evidence that Judeans worshipped the Judean god, okay, Yahweh. But we also have evidence at each of these locations that the Judeans revered, in some way or form. I'll keep that term very vague, because exactly what the beliefs were is hard to say. But I'll tell you what the evidence is in a second. at least revered other gods aside from the Judean God. So, for example, let's start with Elephantine, where we have the most evidence. At Elephantine, we have Judeans that build a temple to the god, they call him Yahweh, right? Yud He Vav. But alongside this temple to the god Yahweh, they're collecting monies for Yahweh and for other deities as well. So, for example, we have they're collecting monies as donations for Anat Yahweh, right? This seems to be some kind of a female consort, the Anat of Yahweh, the consort to the Judean god. And we have other deities named as well. We have Judeans naming their children with theophoric elements. So, names of divinities that are included in the name. A theophoric element in a name would be like, my name, Yonatan, is Yo-Natan. The Judean god, Yud Vav, gave, right? It's, by the way, Netanyahu is the same name, just backwards. So we have these theophoric elements of foreign deities, as well as the Judean deity. So clearly, when we're in the 5th century before the Common Era, which is when the Elephantine documents date to, we have, at least in Elephantine, Judeans revering foreign gods, also taking oaths by the names of foreign gods, along with the Judean god. We have a similar situation in Babylonia, where we have Judeans taking oaths by foreign gods. And in, when I say Babylonia, by the way, the evidence comes from cuneiform tablets from 2 sites, a site called Al Yahudu, and we also have the Murashu archive. So these are 2 archives. Murashu is a little bit later than the Al Yahudu archive, but again, date to the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. Similar situation. In Judea, we actually have less evidence in terms of in general. Textual evidence for sure, epigraphic evidence, written documents that have survived from Judea. What we do have in Judea are coins. And on these coins, we have art, right? Depictions of foreign goddesses. So we have, for example, Athena on silver coins that were minted in Judea. Athena's owl, the attribute of Athena, the owl, which we find on Judean coins. Not only do we find this on Judean coins, we find Judean coins with the names of Judean governors, like Hezekiah, and there's also a Judean high priest named Yochanan, which has on it the owl of Athena. Right, so we have the name Yochanan HaKohen, Yochanan the priest, and in the middle of it has the attribute of Athena, the Athenian owl. Now, these coins, to be fair, are copies of Athenian coins. They're copies of coins that were minted in Athens. They're minted in Judea by Judeans, and the Judeans copied these motifs. But they're certainly pagan, as far, polytheistic, let's put it that way, and which is super interesting. So certainly there is no evidence that Judeans at this time, in the Persian period, up until the conquest of Alexander the Great in, let's say, 332 BC, there's no evidence that they were worshiping only the Judean god in any kind of monotheistic or monolattrist kind of way. There's no evidence for that in this early period.
Before the Pentateuch became a very popular and popularly read book in the 2nd century BC, 1st century BC era, where do you think this text might have been circulating before it became widely popular?
So I don't know, right? I don't know. We don't have evidence for this. We can only imagine. So again, when it was written, I don't know. After it was written and edited and so on, we don't know. We don't know if I can give you, two ends of the spectrum. One end of the spectrum is that it was sitting on a shelf gathering dust. Nobody looked at it for decades, centuries. It's a possibility. As long as the physical copy of the book was able to survive enough time until it could be copied again, that's certainly a possibility. Another possibility is that it was, as you said, circulating amongst a small group of people. So again, it's easy to imagine that there might have been some small group of people that were reading this text, perhaps even putting it into practice. Certainly, it's a possibility. The issue is that we don't have evidence for any of this. We simply don't know. And I don't see much reason to conjecture in either direction as long as we don't have evidence. Now, I should point out that we do have a translation of the Pentateuch into Greek called the Septuagint. And there are scholars that would like to date the Septuagint to the 3rd century before the Common Era. On the basis, I think the strongest evidence is linguistic based. I can't weigh in on that because my Greek is not good enough to be able to tell you that the Greek of the Septuagint is specifically 3rd century BCE and not 2nd century BCE. How scholars are able to get to that determination, I don't know. But as far as I can tell, that's the best evidence that they have for dating the Septuagint that early. Aside from the mythical story that we find in the letter of Aristeas that Ptolemy II had the Septuagint, this is a mythical story. There's no reason to think that anything of the sort actually happened. But let's say that the Septuagint was translated in the 3rd century before the Common Era. Okay, what does that mean? What kind of distribution did the Pentateuch have at this time? I don't know. All you need is one copy to be sitting in Hebrew, to be sitting in front of a translator, and you can have a translation. So I don't think that the fact that the Septuagint was translated necessarily implies any kind of wide-scale circulation. So to answer your question very simply, I don't know. I don't know how widely the Pentateuch was circulating, if it was circulating at all, prior to the 2nd century before the Common Era, when we suddenly have evidence that it was widely circulating.
I want to return to the elephantine papyri for a minute. Some would look at this text as, okay, you got what appears to be an earlier version of the Jewish God in there being mentioned as having this consort on not Yahoo. And some look at this and they have the opinion that this is some kind of evidence of could be early syncretism between an earlier version of the Jewish God, possibly with a Canaanite God, or having been originally a Canaanite deity even. What are your thoughts on this, if you have any?
Okay, so the question of when when this notion of Yahweh, of the Judean God, Israelite God, first appears, how far back it goes, does it predate any kind of Israelite identity, any kind of Judean identity? These are certainly interesting questions, fascinating questions, as far as I can tell. They're not questions that I deal with because, again, there absolutely, we know there was a Judean group, a group of people who self-identified as Judeans, as Yehudim, in Aramaic Yehudae, right? In Greek as Judaioi, right? This group of people existed for a long time. They existed. Our earliest evidence is from the 8th century before the Common Era. We have in Assyrian documents, Hezekiah the Judean is mentioned in Sennacherib's, in texts from the time of Sennacherib. There definitely were people who self-identified and were identified by others as Judeans. These Judeans worshipped a god that was named Yahweh, right? Yud He Vav He. We have no doubt about this. We have people naming themselves, their children, using theophoric elements from this name. There's no doubt about that. And we have the name written out in texts from this early time and from earlier periods as well. There's no doubt about this. That's not a question that I'm looking at in this book, because this goes back a long time. This does not assume that we have a Torah. This does not assume that even if there was a Torah, that it was widely known and practiced, right? So these are separate issues. I think that people get confused because today, when we speak of Judaism, all of these things are implied, right? We assume that if you have somebody practicing Judaism, that they identify as a Jew and that they are, if they're practicing Judaism, they're keeping the laws of the Torah in their practice of Judaism, so in one way or another, right? And we assume that it's a religion, right? We call this a religion like we have, the same semantic category that we have for Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Tao, whatever it is. These we all call religions. All right, but this is a very modern notion that we can take all of these things and put them under one category, which we call religion. This is not what I'm looking at, right? So I'm not looking at modern day Judaism. I'm looking at the laws of one of the laws of the Torah being practiced by ordinary people, and that the earliest evidence for that comes much later than the earliest evidence we have for Judeans or the Judean God. These are separate issues.
So when do you think that, at least in terms of maybe not precisely when, but the time period that it certainly happened by, that the Samaritans and the Jews broke up into two separate groups?
Okay, so that's also an interesting question. We have certainly in the Persian period already, Samaria and Judea are separate provinces. So we have this distinction between people that are living in Samaria, people that are living in Judea. The people living in Samaria don't seem to be identifying as Judeans, and Judeans, that's an identity group. Samaritans seem to be a separate identity group. An interesting question is, we know that eventually the Samaritans did adopt the Torah and did practice the laws of the Torah, as did the Judeans, and in fact that is the case until today, right? So we have today Samaritans, not many. Unfortunately, we have, I think, less than 1,000 surviving Samaritans today, but they have a Pentateuch very similar to ours, very similar to the Jewish Pentateuch, Jewish Christian Pentateuch, very similar. And the question is, when did Samaritans adopt the Pentateuch as their Torah? And scholars often think that it was earlier than the 2nd century before the Common Era, but again, we have no evidence for that. And in the book, what I suggest is that very possibly what happened was, we know that the Samaritans were conquered by the Hasmoneans towards the end of the 2nd century before the Common Era. So let's say the last decade or the last 2 decades before 100 BCE. And the Hasmoneans destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. It seems to me quite likely that what happened was when the Samaritans came and conquered when the Hasmoneans came and conquered the Samaritans, they brought the Torah to the Samaritans. Why do I think that might very well be the case? We have evidence from written sources that when the Hasmoneans conquered the Idumeans, which is another neighbor to the south of Judea, they did exactly that. They enforced the rules of the Torah on the Idumeans. They forced them to circumcise, and they forced them to keep the laws of the Torah. We know that when the Hasmoneans, so this was John Hyrcanus, the same Hasmonean ruler that conquered the Idumeans, also conquered the Samaritans. So I don't think it's unlikely that if the Hasmoneans did this to the Idumeans in the south, that they wouldn't have done something similar to the Samaritans in the north. John Hyrcanus's son, Aristobulus I, conquered a northern tribe in Galilee called the Etrurians, and he is said to have done the same thing with them, to enforce the laws of the Torah on the Etrurians, force them to keep the rules of the Torah. Today we would call that forced conversion, right? He forced them to convert to Judaism. But the terms that are used in the ancient sources are that he forced them to circumcise and to keep the laws, the customs of the fathers. I believe that's the term. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that the same thing happened with the Samaritans, and that in fact that is the source of the Samaritans' adoption of the Torah as their own Samaritanism, right? As opposed to Judaism. This is when the Samaritans, I think it's quite likely, began to keep the laws of the Torah themselves.
And as for the different sectarian movements, when do you think that? Let me rephrase that. What is the earliest evidence that we have for the Essenes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees?
Right. So scholars think that the sectarian movements that we have, right, the various sects that we have from the late Second Temple period, probably split off sometime during the Hasmonean period, probably in the 2nd century before the Common Era. I think that this is quite telling that we have the sects splitting specifically at this time. We have to remember that the Pentateuch is a very opaque text, right? It's essentially impossible to keep the rules of the Pentateuch without interpreting them. So interpretation is an incredibly important element in Judaism. We cannot have Judaism without interpretation. Now, you put two Jews into a room, put two people into a room, give them a text, tell them interpret this text. You're going to have three different opinions. Right? That's the joke. You put two Jews into a room, you give them a Torah to interpret or whatever it is, ask them their opinion about something, you're going to have three different opinions. Why is that? Because we're human beings and we interpret things differently because we have different experiences and we have different makeups and we grew up in different homes and so on and so forth. We think differently because we're different people. And as such, it is essentially impossible to have Judaism without having disagreements. You cannot have Judaism without which is based on the notion that the Torah, the Pentateuch, is the base text which needs to be interpreted and not have arguments about it. So the fact that the sects emerge in the 2nd century before the Common Era, I think is quite suggestive of the idea that the Torah only became well known and regarded as authoritative sometime around then, right? So what I'm imagining here is that the Torah becomes authoritative, and the sects start to argue about, okay, how do we interpret this? And then we have the sects splitting. I think that the Hasmoneans here very well may have played an important role. So I mentioned that the Hasmoneans are going around conquering Idumeans, conquering the Samaritans, conquering the Etrurians, enforcing the rules of the Torah on them. This we know happened. I don't think it's much of a stretch to think that the Hasmoneans did the same thing with the Judeans themselves. So, perhaps in the same generation, perhaps a generation or two before, sometime in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, it seems to me quite likely that it was the Hasmoneans themselves, this ruling family, by the way, a priestly family, that decided to adopt the Pentateuch as the written law, the official law of this newly independent nation. So, we have the Maccabean revolt, we have a newly independent state, this Judean state, which, for the first time since the Iron Age, we have an independent Judean state. The Hasmoneans that are ruling the state needed something to bind the Judeans together and the people that they had conquered, all the various nations that they had conquered, into one unit, right? One political unit, a unified group. And the Pentateuch, I suggest, may very well have been that thing which would have unified all of these people, right? In the book, I say that the Pentateuch might have been used as a sort of, like we have in the United States, a declaration of independence and a constitution, right? Because the Pentateuch isn't only laws, it's also the founding story of the Israelites, right? How the Israelites came about, the patriarchs, the sojourn in Egypt, the Exodus, and so on and so forth, and then we have the laws. So I think it's somewhat akin to a Declaration of Independence, right? The origin story of the Israelites, and amalgamated with that a constitution, right? So the Judean constitution would have been the laws that we find in the Pentateuch. So I think that the place of the Hasmoneans here could very well be critical.
Just want to return real quick to the practices. What is the earliest evidence that we have for the practice of the Sabbath?
So again, 2nd century before the Common Era, no earlier. So again, the methodology that I use in the book is that I start with the 1st century of the Common Era. A ton of evidence we have for Sabbath observance. Unfortunately, we don't really have archaeological evidence because Sabbath observance just isn't something which leaves material traces. But authors, both Judean authors, non-Judean authors, are attesting to widespread observance of prohibitions on the Sabbath. And of course, there's arguments about exactly what that means, what's allowed, what's not allowed. We find in the Gospels Jesus arguing with his interlocutors about what is allowed on the Sabbath, what's not allowed. Judeans were arguing about this, but this is going on in the 1st century of the Common Era. We find evidence for this also in the 1st century before the Common Era. We have, cities in the Eastern Mediterranean which are allowing their Judean citizens to join the army because they can't keep the Sabbath properly in the army. And assorted evidence from this early period, also the 2nd century before the Common Era. We have stories from 1 and 2 Maccabees about Judeans giving their lives and not to fight on the Sabbath. The earliest evidence that we have of this sort is from the 2nd century before the Common Era. There's nothing from earlier periods which indicate that Judeans were abstaining from this or that kind of work, any kind of prohibitions that Judeans are keeping on the Sabbath. We don't have before the 2nd century BCE. Now, the term Sabbath appears in biblical texts outside of the Pentateuch, which seem to predate the 2nd century BCE. But first of all, there's no reason to think that in almost all of these texts, there's no reason to think that we're talking about a Sabbath which occurs one day out of every 7, right, on Saturday, let's say. We don't have any indication, in fact, from the Hebrew Bible outside of the Pentateuch that there was a 7-day week. There's one verse in Ezekiel, but aside from that and the Pentateuch, there's no evidence that Judeans at large were keeping a 7-day week at all. And there's also no evidence that they were keeping prohibitions of any sort on the Sabbath. Now, what this early Sabbath might have been, scholars debate. There are some scholars that think this might have been a monthly holiday of some sort. But what's important for my purposes is that there's no reason to think that any kind of Pentateuchal Sabbath, where you have it occurring 1 day a week with prohibitions, there's no evidence for this prior to the 2nd century BC. There's no evidence that this was widely observed.
Before I get to my questions, could you tell the audience a little bit about your upcoming book and what it tackles differently from your prior one?
Sure. So essentially, we could. I'm sorry about that. Essentially,
No
we can
problem.
think of the new book as something of a prequel to the origins of Judaism. So, in the origins of Judaism, I looked at when we have the earliest evidence for observance of Torah on a wide-scale basis, and there are conclusions in that book was that there is no evidence from before the Hasmonean period in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. What I do in this book is I look at that period right before the Hasmonean period, the early Hellenistic period, to see what was Judean cult and culture like during this period, right before the Hasmoneans come to power, right before we have our earliest evidence of Judaism. And my interest there is to see both cult, so what cultic practices look like as far as we can tell, and what culture. And I look at several features of Judean culture during this period, right before when Judaism begins. So I entitled the book "Between Yahwism and Judaism," and I'm sure we'll get into what I mean by Yahwism, what I mean by Judaism in the discussion, but this is the period of transition, or the period right before the transition to when Judaism first emerges.
So what is the earliest evidence that we have when it comes to, because I think I like to start with we have stories like Ezra, and he brought out a law for the Persian king. When you look at stories like that in the book of Ezra, does the archaeological record indicate a different story, or something that may potentially conflict with what the texts actually say?
So the story that you're referring to in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah tell the story of a Judean priest coming from Babylonia, Ezra, who was a priest and a scribe. And the story goes that Ezra brings a Torah, the book of the law of Moses, to the Judeans. And for the first time, the Judeans hear about this law of the Torah. They hadn't known about it before, and Ezra is the one that brings it. According to the book of Ezra, in Ezra 7, it was the king of Persia, Artaxerxes, that instructed Ezra to bring this Torah to Judea. And then later on in the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah 8, we hear the story of Ezra opening this Torah scroll in front of all of the people of Judah in Jerusalem and reading this Torah. For the first time, the people had discovered that there is something called the Torah of Moses. And according to the story, they discover that they are to celebrate the holiday of Sukkot in the 7th month, and immediately they go set about to do that. And that's the story in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The question is, are these simply stories, or is there some kind of historical background to this? Scholars usually think, and since the 19th century, scholars have believed that these stories are historical. They happened more or less as is told. And as a result of this belief in these stories, scholars have assumed that, well, we then have Judaism emerging, because if the people are keeping the laws of the Torah, already in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. King Artaxerxes, so presumably we're talking about the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era. We should start to talk about Judaism already in the middle of the 5th century BCE. And if you look in standard books about early Judaism, they will tell you that Judaism emerges in the Persian period, the middle of the 5th century BCE. The problem with this way of going about history is that we can't just simply take a biblical story and say, well, it sounds like it could have happened. There's no miracles in it. There's nothing. There's no reason to question these stories. So let's just believe that they happened as they're told. That is, again, the standard way that scholars have been approaching these stories, and of course, that's, you and I both know that this is not the way we do history, and we need to go about attacking this question from a different angle. And the angle that I suggest in my first book that you had held up before, I have a copy here as well, The Origins of Judaism. The way that I go about it in this book is by looking for actual evidence. So what evidence do we have that Judeans are actually keeping the laws of the Torah? And the way I go about it in this book is I take a period of time when we have ample evidence that the Judeans are keeping the laws of the Torah. And that, as it turns out, in the 1st century of the Common Era, we have ample evidence, both historical, textual evidence, and archaeological evidence, material remains, which indicate that Judeans are keeping the laws of the Torah on a wide-scale basis. I then go backwards in time to look at the 1st century before the Common Era, the 2nd century before the Common Era, the 3rd century before the Common Era, and so on and so forth, looking to see when does that trail of evidence end. And as it turns out, the trail of evidence ends in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. So we're talking about the Hasmonean period. Before that, there's simply no evidence that has survived indicating that Judeans are keeping the laws of the Torah. So that is suggestive of something. Why is there no evidence before? Is it possible that before the middle of the 2nd century, before the Common Era, there was wide-scale observance of the Torah, but simply no evidence has survived? Possible. But at a certain point, we have to ask, well, okay, why is it that there is no evidence, positive evidence? And then when we start to look carefully at the Persian period, we see that there's actually some negative evidence, which would suggest that the Judeans were not keeping the laws of the Torah. And those two together, the fact that there's no positive evidence and there is some negative evidence, lead me to suspect that probably the Persian period is not the best period of time to be searching for the beginnings of Judaism. It probably began after that. Now, I'm not the only one to recognize that the Persian period has some evidence for non-observance of the Torah already. From the early 20th century, we have the evidence from Elephantine, which indicates that Judeans there didn't know about the Torah. There's no evidence that they knew about the Torah. There's negative evidence, which indicates that they were not keeping the laws of the Torah. They were worshiping several gods. They had a temple outside of Jerusalem, which goes against the Deuteronomy, the notion in Deuteronomy that there should be a central cult. So altogether, the evidence at Elephantine suggests that those Judeans were not keeping Judaism. But then we also have evidence from elsewhere, from Mesopotamia and from Judea itself. We'll talk about this, I'm sure, during our discussion, which seems to indicate that the Judeans were not keeping the laws of the Torah. So, like I said, I'm not the only one to notice this, that in the Persian period we have negative evidence. And this has led scholars, especially in more recent years, to begin to use a different term when speaking about the Persian period. And that term is, if we're not going to call the Judean, I don't like to use the word religion, but for our purposes, we'll speak about Judean religion. If we're not going to call it Judaism, let's think of a different word that we can use. And the word that scholars have come up with is Yahwism. So the idea is that in the Persian period, Judeans had inherited from their Iron Age forebears this worship, the central worship of Yahweh. So the central Judean god was named Yahweh, and so we can call the worship of Yahweh Yahwism, and that we can use that we can use as a term for speaking about Judean religion already in the Iron Age, but also into the Persian period. So that is a term which has become a much more common in recent years. And then what I'm doing here in my book, Between Yahwism and Judaism, is looking at the period right after the Persian period, but right before the Hasmonean period. So that period right in between. And the question is, should we be thinking of that early Hellenistic period as more akin to what came before? Do we have continuity from the earlier Persian period, or do we start to see something like we begin to see under the Hasmoneans, where we can start to talk about Judaism? So how should we be thinking about this early Hellenistic period, which falls in between the Persian period and the Hasmonean period? Just to be clear about the dates, so the early Hellenistic period begins with the conquests of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquers the East, specifically the Levant, which is particularly of interest to us, in 332 BCE. And for me, the end of the early Hellenistic period, at least for the purposes of the book, is 175 BCE, with the death of Seleucus the fourth and the rise of Antiochus the fourth, his son. So I'm ending my survey right before the events which lead to the Hasmonean revolt.
Now, some will try to say, well, what about the Septuagint? Because we have the letter of Aristeas, and we know that the Septuagint was 3rd century BCE, or we supposedly know. And the letter of Aristeas is powerful evidence that, well, the Septuagint which was originally just the first 5 books of the Tanakh, the Torah, was translating surely a Hebrew text into Greek in the 3rd century BCE. But what are the potential problems with this story that were provided from the letter of Aristeas?
Right. Good. So that's the story of the letter of Aristeas falls exactly in the 3rd century BCE. So this is the period of interest for me for this book. And if we were to take the story at its word, we have here the translation of the Torah into Greek by a group of 70 odd Judean scholars. And one would think that would suggest that this means that Judaism existed, that people were following the Torah. There must have been a reason why the Torah was translated into Greek. It must have been in order to, and then you could fill in the blanks, the reason why you want to give for why the Torah was translated into Greek. So some people think that the reason the Torah was the reason given in the letter of Aristeas, by the way, is that the king Ptolemy wanted a copy of the Torah for his library in Alexandria, or at least his librarian wanted a copy of the Torah translated into Greek. But scholars have, on the one hand, have rejected this story as fictional. So scholars have long recognized that the story is late, probably dates to the 2nd century BCE, and most scholars reject the story as fictional. But most scholars also, at the same time, accept the dating for the Septuagint. I'm happy that you said supposedly, because I'm somewhat skeptical about the dating of the Septuagint. I don't think we have good evidence, or at least very compelling evidence for the dating. But many scholars think that it was translated around the time that that we are told in the letter of Aristeas. So let's say around the middle of the second century, excuse me, the middle of the 3rd century BCE. But okay, let's imagine that the Septuagint does in fact date to this time period, the middle of the 3rd century, the end of the 3rd century. It doesn't matter so much. The question is, what does this mean for the widespread knowledge and spread of the Torah? I don't think it says very much, because the very fact that the Torah was translated into Greek does not mean that the Torah was necessarily well known. It means that some people knew about it, obviously enough. It was known enough to intellectuals, people who knew how to read and knew how to translate from Hebrew to Greek, that this was done, right? That doesn't say anything about what the ordinary people knew about or cared about, right? So in my scholarship in general, my scholarship is always focused on the ordinary people. I'm interested in what ordinary people were doing, what ordinary people knew about, what ordinary people were thinking, what their practices were. And in looking at what the ordinary people were doing, I don't really care what a small group of intellectuals was interested in, knew about, and what they were spending their time on. So the very fact that the Torah might have been translated in the 3rd century doesn't give us any clues. Even it really says nothing about what ordinary people knew about or cared about. It's very easy to imagine a small group of people, of intellectuals, that knew about this Torah of Moses and cared about it enough that they would have wanted to translate it into Greek. That doesn't say anything about your ordinary people.
What do you make of the story in Josephus about Antiochus the Third and all who belong to the people are to be governed in accordance with their ancestral laws? And I asked this question in the context of, if the Septuagint, if the dating of the Septuagint is incorrect, how much later could it potentially have been from the standard dating?
Okay, so first of all, it's important to recognize that okay, in terms of Antiochus III, Josephus, our source for the proclamation of Antiochus III comes from Josephus, as you said. We don't have any document from the time of Antiochus III, again dating to around 200 BCE. Let me step back for a second. The Levant, the southern Levant, was occupied by the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt in the 3rd century BCE. Come around 200 BCE, the Seleucids, so that's the northern kingdom ruling out of Antioch in Syria, came down and took over the southern Levant from the Ptolemaic kingdom. And according to Josephus, after Antiochus III was the Seleucid king at the time, after Antiochus III took over the southern Levant, he recognized that the Judeans had supported him in his conquest of the southern Levant, and in return, he allowed them to keep, or to continue to keep, their ancestral laws. That's the story that Josephus tells, and Josephus quotes a supposed proclamation of Antiochus III. There's some question among scholars if this document is authentic, if we should believe Josephus that this was an actual document from Antiochus III. Many scholars, perhaps most scholars, think that it is authentic. And okay, I don't know. Let's imagine that this is an authentic document. We still don't have a description of the Torah. The ancestral laws of the Judeans is not a strange thing to encounter. We have ancestral laws of other peoples. that also were given, other peoples that were conquered by Hellenistic rulers were often given the opportunity to continue to keep their ancestral laws. So this is not something unique to the Judeans, and the term ancestral laws, uh, it just means the laws that the people have always kept. All peoples have laws, right? Laws are something that you need to govern society, for society not to fall apart. And so all peoples have ancestral laws. The fact that Josephus refers to the ancestral laws of the Judeans in the year 200 BCE, again, is not necessarily an indication that we're talking about the Torah. And recently, Professor Reinhard Kratz of Göttingen University in Germany published an entire book on these ancestral laws, where he makes essentially this argument that the ancestral laws that we find before the period of the Hasmoneans was not the laws of the Torah.
So now I want to ask you about the administration of Judea. You mention, and you bring up over here, the limestone from Marisha containing an order in Greek from Seleucus concerning Olympiodorus, and that this seems to indicate that there wasn't a precise Judean high priestly administration, something like that. Could you expand on that?
So this inscription, and there's actually copies that were found elsewhere in Byblos, if I'm not mistaken. What we find here is that the king, the Seleucid king Seleucus IV, instructs Heliodorus, his we can call him perhaps a prime minister, something along those lines, in terms of the temples that are under the jurisdiction of the Seleucids. There's actually no mention of the Judeans in this inscription, but what we find is that in his day, in the day of Seleucus the fourth, the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, the Seleucid kingdom is increasingly taking over the matters of the temples. And from here, we can infer that before the time of Seleucus IV, before this happened, the temples throughout the Seleucid realm, perhaps also in the Ptolemaic realm, were much more independent. And in fact, we find evidence of a certain independence of the temples, or at least the Temple of Jerusalem, in the early Hellenistic period. So, for example, we have, well, already going back to the Persian period, we find in the Elephantine papyrus, one of the Elephantine papyruses, that refers to a Yochanan, the high priest of Jerusalem, and it also refers to the other priests that were under him. And this was from the end of the 5th century BCE. So we have this. We already, learn about the high priest and the priesthood of Jerusalem during the Persian period, at the end of the 5th century BCE. A high priest in Jerusalem continued to exist. This office of high priesthood continued to exist in Jerusalem into the 4th century BCE, and we find that on coins, for example. So if you can scroll up or down, I'm not sure where you are here, where I talk about the high priesthood. There's a coin which mentions the name of the high priest. I think we have to go up the other direction, behind. Mentions the high priest by the name of Yochania. No, if you go up.
Let me see if I can.
Yeah, there's a coin which mentions the name of the high priest at the end of the 4th century BCE. The high priest's name is, there we go, Yochania, the priest. And this is a fascinating coin because on the one hand, it's written in Paleo-Hebrew, Yochania, the priest. Presumably we're talking about a high priest. But the images that we see on this coin are really fascinating. So on the face of the coin, on the left side, we see a face, right? A portrait of some kind. And surrounding the face is a circle. And this has been interpreted as a shield with a gorgon in the center. So this is interpreted as the shield of Athena, the aegis of Athena. And on the other side, we have an owl. And that, of course, is the famous owl of Athena. And right surrounding the owl, on both sides of the owl, are the names is the name and the title of the high priest of Jerusalem, Yochaniah. That's a Yahwistic name, the priest. So this is fascinating. So first of all, this is evidence of a high priest in Jerusalem at the end of the 4th century BCE. The coin has been dated to the pre-Ptolemaic Macedonian period. So this is after the conquests of Alexander the Great, before Ptolemy I takes over as king of Egypt and as the ruler over the southern Levant. And we have here a Judean high priest in Jerusalem minting coins with motifs that are associated, very clearly associated, with the Greek goddess Athena. Now, in the book, what I suggest is that we need to consider the fact that Athena in the East, among the Semitic peoples, was identified as the Semitic goddess Anat. Anat and Athena are essentially one and the same goddess. We find, for example, on Phoenician inscriptions, we have Phoenician inscriptions that have both Phoenician, written in Phoenician script, which speak of the goddess Anat, and on the same inscription we have in Greek a Greek inscription that mentions Athena. So these were known as one and the same goddess. This warrior, virgin warrior goddess that was worshipped throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, in Egypt as well. Now, what's fascinating is that we know that the Judeans were worshiping, revering, recognizing a goddess named Anat Yahu in Elephantine. So at Elephantine, we have this goddess Anat Yahu, which presumably means a female goddess associated with Yahu. So that's the Yahweh, as he was known in Elephantine, Yahu. And this Anat Yahu was associated with him, perhaps was his consort. And this is at the end of the 5th century BCE. 1 century later, we have Athena / Anat on coins in Judea. So I don't think that it would be too much of a stretch to argue that the coins which show Anat / Athena on the coins in Judea were more than simply a nod to Athenian coins from Athens, which have the owl of Athena on them. These coins, by the way, are unique. There are no coins in Athens that have the aegis of Athena on one side and an owl on the other side. So this is a uniquely Judean coin, which is certainly at least nodding in some way to recognition of Athena / Anat. I don't want to make too much of it because in the end of the day, what it is a coin. It's hard to interpret. It's hard to know what the beliefs were behind this coin. But at the very least, it's certainly suggestive that Judeans in Judea, living in Jerusalem, under a high priest with a Yahwistic name, were carrying coins that had motifs associated with the goddess Athena. So this is something, at the very least, which doesn't look like Judaism, right? It looks like something else. And that something else looks similar to what we found 1 century before in the Persian period at Elephantine, which again, it's suggestive, and what it is suggestive of is a continuity from the Persian period into the early Hellenistic period. And this is if we look at this from a longue durée perspective, the Yahwism that we find in the Persian period, this non-exclusive Yahwism, continues to be found as we go into the early Hellenistic period.
So now I would like to shift to the use of names. You mentioned here that names are usually identified as Judean either because they contain a Yahwistic theophoric element, or else because historical sources suggest that the name was used primarily by Judeans. So my question is, so when do we start seeing these theophoric names? And my second part to that question is, when do we start seeing any names attested that resemble anything like Moses or other famous biblical figures?
Okay, so in terms of names with a theophoric element associated with Yahweh, so Yahwistic names, that we already have in the Iron Age. So we have, no small number of inscriptions which give names that have Yahwistic theophoric elements. Any name that has Yah or Yahoo at the end, or Yah or Yahoo in the beginning. These are Yahwistic names, and we have no small number already in the Iron Age, which suggests that we already have Yahwism during this time period. Aside from inscriptions that mention the god Yahweh as a name, we also have these Yahwistic names of humans, of people that have these Yahwistic theophoric elements. So this we have already in the Iron Age, from, let's say, the 9th century BCE. And this continues onwards into the 8th century, the 7th century, 6th century, 5th century. I mentioned the 5th century in Elephantine, we continue to have Yahwistic names. Onwards into the 4th century and onwards until today. My name, Yonatan, is a Yahwistic name. So we have straight throughout from the 9th century BCE until the 21st century, Judeans / Jews and Samaritans, by the way, as well, who are giving their children names with Yahwistic theophoric elements. So this is not something new to Judaism. This is a part of Yahwism. Part of Yahwism is recognizing the Judean God through naming of children. So this begins already in the 9th century BC, or at least our earliest evidence for this is in the 9th century BCE. In terms of names of biblical characters, so that's something which actually begins very, very late. Even in antiquity, even into late antiquity, names of biblical heroes like Moses are extraordinarily rare. So there's a book, or a set of books, by Talilan, which collects all names of Jews wherever they're to be found, whether in Judea, in Babylonia, in the Western diaspora, the Eastern diaspora, wherever she found names, both in textual sources, in epigraphic sources, in inscriptions, wherever she found names, she collected them. This is a work of years, ant work, collecting these names. And her conclusions were that these the biblical heroes like Moses and David, and the big names that we find in the biblical stories are mostly absent from the Judean onomasticon, from the Judean list of names, which is in itself very interesting. She suggests that it's something. The reason for this could be that these names were considered too special, too important to be given to a mere baby that has just been born. We can think something along the lines of the name Jesus, that at least in English-speaking countries, uh, people don't name their child Jesus. I know in Hispanic countries, Jesus is a common name, but in English-speaking countries, it's not. And the reason is that we don't name our children Jesus. That it's too special of a name for Christians to be naming their children Jesus. Possibly, this is what Taliban suggests. The biblical heroes were also not very commonly given as names.
So I want to go back to Anat for a second. And so, would you say that when you look at the evidence that Anat appears to or could be interpreted as possibly Yahweh's wife, and from the Elephantine papyri, would you say that's kind of like reminiscent of what we see with the Asherah and Yahweh in its Asherah inscription? The only difference is it would appear a different goddess as being identified as his wife as opposed to Anat.
Possibly, your guess here is as good as mine. There's so little to go on. All we have with the Kuntilat Adrud inscription that you're alluding to, um, uh, where we have the name of the Judean god together with Va'asherato and his Asherah. So scholars have been debating since this was discovered. I believe it was in the late 70s, if I'm not mistaken. Um, what does this mean? What is the connection between the Judean god and Asherah? Is this his wife? Perhaps. There's a lot of discussion about that, and about the Elephantine papyrus as well. Anat Yahu, what exactly does that mean? Is Anat the consort of Yahweh? Could we give another interpretation? I don't have anything to add to either of these debates. But what's important for me is that we have at this time, as late as the 5th century BCE at Elephantine, Anat, right? Whether it is the wife of Yahweh or some other connection, the point is we have this Yahwism that is not exclusive of a single Judean god that cannot be worshipped in association with any other gods or goddesses. The fact that we have Anat in a Judean context, and she is being revered. Right, there are monies that are being collected in her name. This is very significant. What I am suggesting in my present book is that this seems to have continued well into the essentially until the end of the 4th century BCE, into the early Hellenistic period. So this is what's interesting here, that we have this non-exclusive Yahwism continuing from the Persian period into the early Hellenistic period, which is quite a bit later than scholars have normally thought. Scholars usually talk about Judaism emerging in the 5th century BCE, in the Persian period. And here we have non-exclusive, what seems to be, or what can be argued to be, non-exclusivist Yahwism continuing into the early Hellenistic period.
So now I want to ask about this fragment written by Tubius to a Ptolemaic official, mentioning many thanks to the gods. Do we have, besides that document, do we have other documents in which multiple gods are being acknowledged? I remember a while back, not too long ago, you posted on X something about the Passover papyri, in which there was more than one deity
Exactly.
being mentioned.
So exactly. So that what we find in the so-called Passover papyrus, which is dated to the end of the 5th century BCE, we have a mention of Elahiah in Aramaic, which means the gods, we have a Judean that is greeting the addressee with a prayer or a solicitation of the gods in plural. And again, we have a continuation of this into the 3rd century BCE. It seems that this letter comes from a Judean official or a Judean personality, probably living in Transjordan. And again, he opens with a formulaic many thanks to the gods. Now, this piece of this data point can, of course, be interpreted as, it could be interpreted away. So it's very easy to apologetically explain that this is just a formulaic expression. It doesn't mean anything. The same, by the way, has been said of the so-called Passover papyrus. It doesn't really mean the gods, or at least the writer didn't intend to show any kind of reverence for a multiplicity of gods. This was simply a formulaic way of opening a letter. And yeah, we can do that. We can do that also, by the way, with the coins, with the images of Athena that we find in the coins that we just discussed. We can do that. We can explain away all of these data points. But I think it's important, first of all, to collect them, to collect all the data points that we have. If we want to try to understand what Judean cult and culture was like in this early Hellenistic period, the first order of business is to collect all the data points that we have. If you then want to explain them away, you can do that. Nobody's going to stop you. But it's important to collect all the data points and then to see what is the picture that's emerging. Now, it's important to say very clearly here that we don't have that many data points. There's a limit to how much data we have from the early Hellenistic period. We do have papyri from Egypt. We do have coins, which I mentioned, from Judea. We have inscriptions here and there on ostraca and various inscriptions, but not that many. And that's why each of these data points is so important, because this is what we have. And what I argue is that the picture that emerges from these relatively few data points is a picture of continuity from the earlier Persian period. So it's, as far as we can tell, the kinds of data that have emerged from the Persian period, which indicates a non-exclusive Yahwism, which is not necessarily centered in Jerusalem, where we have temples elsewhere. We have a temple in Elephantine. We seem to have this kind of non-exclusive, non-centralized Yahwism moving into the early Hellenistic period. The early Hellenistic period does not form a break. The fact that Alexander the Great conquered the East didn't change things as far as Yahwism is concerned. And there seems to be a continuity from the Persian period as we go into the early Hellenistic period.
Do we have different versions of the story of Moses in circulation? Do we have different authors talking about stories that different versions of Moses that don't quite line up to the story we're given in the Torah? Like with Diodorus.
Okay, so Diodorus dates to the mid-1st century BCE. And although the reason that I discuss him is because Hecataeus of Abdera is said to have spoken about Moses, said to have described something that seems kind of like Judaism. But this supposed quote from Hecataeus, I don't think is a quote at all. What we find essentially, it's a bit complicated, but to try to make it simple, Photius, who was a 9th century CE Byzantine patriarch of Constantinople, cited in his book Bibliotheca from the 9th century, a now lost book of Diodorus Siculus from the mid-1st century BCE. Okay, and in this citation, we find Diodorus describing the Judeans, and his description sounds like we have Judaism already. He mentions Moses. He mentions Moses establishing um, Jerusalem as its capital, as the capital of the colony of the Judeans, and his description sounds very much like we have Judaism. And then at the end of this whole description, so again, I'm reminding you here, this was written in the mid-1st century BCE. So this is after the Hasmoneans. But then at the end of his description of the Judeans, he writes that this is what Hecataeus had said about the Judeans. Now, scholars often think, oh well, we have here a citation, but this is not a citation. This is simply telling us that Diodorus read some earlier work, which is now lost, of Hecataeus, and amongst his sources, he is citing this earlier work of Hecataeus. By the way, in Photius's writing, it doesn't say Hecataeus of Abdera. It says Hecataeus of Miletus, which is even earlier than Hecataeus of Abdera. But scholars assume that this is just a mistake, and it must be referring to Hecataeus of Abdera, who dates to around 300 BCE. And they also assume that this was an actual quote, right? So the reason why I reject this so-called quote from Hecataeus of Abdera is that Diodorus doesn't no such thing. He doesn't actually quote Hecataeus. He simply tells us that he got his information, which means some of his information, from Hecataeus. So it's very plausible that Diodorus takes his sources from many from many places. It's not just Hecataeus, and what he describes about Judeans, what sounds like Judaism, is in fact Judaism, because he's writing after the Hasmonean period. So the reason that I get into all of this is to show that when scholars think that we have Judaism already in the early Hellenistic period because Hecataeus talks about it, I don't think that that's the case. I simply don't think that we can talk about a Hecataeus quotation which describes something like Judaism.
So, in other words, you wouldn't, as you were just saying, you wouldn't put much stock into saying, "Oh, Hecataeus actually mentioned Moses." You would say Hecataeus probably didn't mention a person called Moses.
I have no idea. I mean, we don't have, as far as I can tell, we don't have a quote from Hecataeus. So I have no idea if Hecataeus knew about a Moses figure. Diodorus knew about a Moses figure. I don't know if Hecataeus knew about a Moses figure.
So, in general, what does this data? What would you say the major implications of this data could potentially have on understanding the origins and the development of Judaism?
So again, if we're looking at the early Hellenistic period, what I see is a continuity. I see a continuation of Judean cult and culture. And again, we haven't gotten into all the details. Let me throw in something else about that we know about the cult of the Judeans at this time. So I mentioned that there was a temple in Elephantine in the 5th century BCE. We have some documents from Edfu, which is not far from Elephantine in Egypt, documents which were written by Judeans in Aramaic, which mention priests. And Sylvie Honigman has suggested that if we have priests in Edfu in the 3rd century BCE, the title priest is not just, like the name Kohen or Cohen that people have today. It's not just a name that has no connection to what the person was actually doing. Priest is a profession, and if we find the name uh, or the title priest, kahana in Aramaic, it's an indication that the person was actually occupied as a priest. This was their occupation, rather than simply a sign of priestly lineage, like the name Cohen would be today. And if we have a functioning priest at this time, that would indicate that we also have a functioning temple. And again, it's not surprising that there would be a functioning temple in Edfu, a Judean temple to the Judean god in Edfu, just as we had a functioning temple to the Judean god in Elephantine. So the Elephantine temple was functioning in the 5th century BCE. These documents date to the 3rd century BCE. But if indeed she's right, by the way, Gad Barnea also wrote about this, that there was probably a Judean temple in Edfu. He thinks that the Edfu community is descended from the Elephantine community, which certainly could be. They're not so far from one another. But in any event, this would again indicate a continuity of a non-centralized Yahwism that we find in Egypt. The other thing that we can talk about, which you're showing here, is stone plaque from a Judean proseuche. So we have this new institution. We haven't encountered it before, from early Hellenistic Egypt. We find several of these plaques which speak about a Judean institution called a proseuche. Proseuche in Greek means prayer, and it seems here to be referring to a place of prayer. And what was this institution, this place of prayer? We don't really know. Presumably, it was a place where Judeans got together to pray. Was this perhaps something like a temple? What was going on in these buildings? Were there sacrifices being offered? Was there incense being offered? Were there perhaps vegetal sacrifices or animal sacrifices? We actually don't know. But there's no indication that these places of prayer looked anything like what we find once Judaism does emerge, which is the synagogue. The synagogue is a place where Judeans got together not to pray, but to read the Torah. So once Judaism does emerge, we need to have an institution where Judeans can be educated in the Torah. Right? That Judaism is centered on the Torah. It's centered on strict observance of a large array of laws. And in order to be able to keep these laws, in order to be able to observe these laws, the Judeans need to know them. And in order to know them, they need to be educated in them. And in order to be educated in them, they needed an institution where this education could take place. And that institution was the synagogue. The synagogue was the place where a community could gather together once a week on the Sabbath, at a time when they weren't working, so they had the time to engage in communal education. And presumably most of the people were illiterate. So, but in a community, you could find at least one person that does know how to read. And a community can also afford to gather the funds to be able to buy a Torah scroll. And on a communal level, you can have education where you would have the one or two people that knew how to read would be able to read from the Torah, explain what was written there, interpret what was written there, and the whole community would be able to enjoy a public form of education in the synagogue. This is the synagogue, which only appears once Judaism appears, so from the Hasmonean period and onward. Most of what we know about the synagogue comes from the 1st century CE, but we seem to have archaeological evidence already from the Hasmonean period that the synagogue institution did exist. The proseuche is a different kind of institution. The prosoche is not. There's no evidence that the prosoche was an institution for education. There's no indication that Torah reading went on in the prosoche. This seems to be something more along the lines of a temple where we have some kind of cultic worship going on rather than education. So again, this is another indication of continuity from the Persian period.
So what about the Hasmonean period? Was there still evidence in the archaeology? Is there still evidence in the archaeology in the Hasmonean period of major Hellenistic influence, or in the Hasmonean period are they already attempting to filter it away and start really the transition more towards the Torah?
Okay, so you brought in a new topic here, which is Hellenistic influence, Greek influence, and the way that you posed the question suggest you hid in the question the notion that Hellenistic influence is somehow counter to the Torah, and it's a very common way of seeing things. I don't see things that way. I don't see any contradiction between Greek culture and the Torah per se. Of course, there are elements of Greek culture which are anathema to the Torah. Polytheistic worship is, of course, forbidden by the Torah. But Greek culture per se, in and of itself, is not in any way, the Torah doesn't legislate anything about Greek culture. What we find, and this is one of the things that I look at in the book, when I look at the degree that Judeans had begun to adopt various elements of Greek culture in the early Hellenistic period. When we look at Judea, Judeans don't seem to be speaking Greek or writing in Greek. That's what we have evidence for. We don't have evidence that Judeans are writing in Greek in the early Hellenistic period. So up until 175 BCE, there are 0 inscriptions that we can clearly associate with Judeans from Judea in Greek. All of the inscriptions that we have are in Aramaic/Hebrew. That includes, by the way, the coins. The coins are in Hebrew. And we don't have that many inscriptions, but the ones that we do have are in Aramaic. So that's interesting. Also, when we look at names in Judea, we don't yet have any names of Judeans that are Greek names in the early Hellenistic period. When we look at Egypt, it's a bit of a more complicated picture. In Egypt, there's a continuation of use of Aramaic, as we had in the Persian period, but we do begin to find the use of Greek in documents from Egypt, from Judean communities in Egypt. And we also begin to find Greek names amongst Judeans in Egypt. So as far as we can tell, there does seem to be a slow adoption of certain aspects of Greek culture in Egypt in the early Hellenistic period, but not in Judea. So that's interesting. When does Greek culture? Oh, and by the way, if we're also looking at material culture in Judea, the adoption of Greek pottery and of Greek architectural elements also doesn't begin in the early Hellenistic period. It's only later that these things begin to be adopted by Judeans. When does Greek culture really come into play in Judea? Only under the Hasmoneans, right? Under the Hasmoneans, we begin to see Greek being used by Judeans. Judeans, of course, are continuing to use Aramaic and Hebrew into the Hasmonean period, but we also begin to find Greek being used, and Greek names begin to be used. Our earliest evidence for this is only from the Hasmonean period and onwards. So the picture that we're seeing here is actually the opposite of what you suggested in your question, under the Hasmoneans, Greek culture begins to flourish amongst Judeans. And that, by the way, continues onwards from the Hasmonean period and onwards into the early Roman period, into the late Roman period. Greek elements of Greek culture become more and more infused amongst the Judeans. What's happening here? How do I understand this? In other words, I'm understanding that Greek culture comes together with Judaism, and that these are not opposing forces. The way that I understand this is that the Hasmoneans, for the first time since the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, for the first time, the Judeans are ruled by an independent Judean polity. This is a polity which begins as a republic, let's call it, and then it becomes a kingdom, becomes increasingly more powerful. And this kingdom begins to expand, and to already under John Hyrcanus the first, the Judeans conquer the Idumeans to the south. Afterwards, they conquer the Turians to the north, the Samaritans, and this small polity of Judea begins to expand throughout the southern Levant, and the Judeans become actually small power, but an actual power in the region. And it's at this time that what had once been a backwater, this small province of the Ptolemaic and then the Seleucid kingdoms, suddenly becomes an independent state, which is a player in the Hellenistic world. And once the Judeans become, like I said, players in the Hellenistic world on the stage of the Hellenistic dynasties, they could no longer be this provincial people that didn't speak Greek and weren't calling their children by Greek names. They needed to become part of the larger world. And the way that they did that was by adopting Greek cultural elements, not in opposition to Judaism, but essentially to strengthen their political power, their political face towards the world, right? So if the fact that the Judeans were now part of the greater Hellenistic world, as Judeans that are keeping the laws of the Torah, so there's no conflict there. Speaking Greek there's nothing in the Torah that says you can't speak Greek. There's nothing in the Torah that says you can't give your children Greek names. So this is what really brought the Judeans out of their shell. Let's put it that way. And I see these things coming together. I really don't see them as a conflict.
And that is why I did ask that question, because I know you don't think that they were in conflict, but that's why I posed the question the way I did anyway. Wayne's World, thank you for your super chat. How many temples were functional in 400 BCE?
Yeah, so I can't answer that question. I don't know. We have the temple at Elephantine, which was destroyed about 10 years before that. There's a question of whether it was rebuilt or not, but circa 400 BCE, Judeans, at least in Elephantine, seem to have had no problem with having a temple aside from the one in Jerusalem. If we want to speak about Yahwists who are not Judeans, we know of a temple on Mount Gerizim. So this was a temple that was built by people living in Samaria. So these are not Judeans, but they are Yahwists. And one of the things that we should consider is that it's possible that Judeans might have visited the temple at Gerizim, and that was not necessarily a problem for them. So there were circa 400 BCE. There was more than one Yahwistic temple. And presumably there were others that we just don't know about.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the words of Ahikar is all about and its connection to the book of Tobit?
Yeah, I don't want to get into that so much because the reason why I speak about it in the book. The question that I ask in the book is what was the literature of the Judeans during the early Hellenistic period, and the reason I mention Achikar is to say that there were clearly other books that were non-biblical, that had nothing that are not, that we don't find in the Hebrew Bible, which were circulating amongst Judeans. We find this at Elephantine in the 5th century BCE. We then later find the Achikar story presented in the book of Tobit, which scholars usually think was written quite a bit later. So these two data points are an indication that Judeans were reading, or at least they knew about stories that were non-biblical. And the question is, again, it's hard to know how widespread this story was, but the fact that we find it out at Elephantine, and the fact that we find it quoted or cited in Tobit suggests that there were these other stories floating around. I think it's important. It's illustrative of what kinds of stories might have been circulating amongst Judeans. And again, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because people, often when they think of Judeans, even as early as the Iron Age, think that the stories that they were telling were the biblical stories. And we should certainly not assume that, right? There's no reason to assume that in early periods before we have Judaism, that the biblical stories were necessarily known and being told. And we also certainly shouldn't assume that there weren't other stories that were known and being told. Achikar happens to be one that we know about, but there were very probably, it's easy to imagine that there were other stories that were being told and that were important to Judeans, which we have simply lost. It's important to remember most of what was going on in antiquity has been lost to us. We simply don't know most of what was going on. We don't know most of the stories that were being told. We don't know most of the rituals that were being practiced, most of the beliefs that people had. The data points. I keep talking about data points because we should be thinking of a panorama of reality from the ancient past, which has simply been lost to us. All that we have left are these little pinpricks of light, these data points that have survived. And when we do have these data points, they're very important, and they can help us imagine what has been lost to us. So the Achikar story is one of these data points, one of these pinpricks of light, which helps us to imagine all the other stories that were being circulated, the literature that was circulated that we have simply lost.
Yurik, thank you for your super chat. Recently, Rabbi Tovia Singer has stated that secular academia has made up the idea that monotheism is a later development in Israel. Thoughts?
So I can't speak specifically to Rabbi Tovia Singer's statement because I didn't hear it. But as for secular academia making up the idea that monotheism is a later development, the question is, what do we mean when we say monotheism developing, right? Monotheism emerging. Are we referring to an idea? And I don't want to get into the technical question of what do we mean by monotheism. Is that I don't want to get too bogged down by the term monotheism. I think we understand what we're talking about. We're talking about a belief in that either there's only a single God that should be worshipped, or there's only a single God that exists. Whatever we whatever it is that we mean when we use that term. It's important to distinguish between an idea developing and emerging and an idea becoming widespread amongst the people. Usually, when scholars talk about an idea emerging, they're talking about the idea emerging in the head of at least one person. And that we can answer by looking at texts. We can look at, biblical texts, and we can try to date them. And on the basis of the dates that we decide, we can try to figure out where do we begin to see the notion of monotheism. That's a very separate question from the work that I do. I look at not when an idea first emerges. I look at when an idea becomes widespread, when it becomes popular. And in both of my books, both the first one and the one that will be coming out shortly, the conclusion is that there does not seem to be this exclusivist Yahwism emerging before the Hasmonean period. That is quite late. And, we have positive evidence that Judeans were worshiping, revering, acknowledging gods aside from a single Judean god. So that's as far as that. There is ample evidence. There is some evidence that there was polytheism. There was a reverence for several gods amongst Judeans, certainly in the Persian period, and as I show in the present book, into the early Hellenistic period.
So when you look at the data in general, would you say that, while not being specific about, okay, this piece of stuff over here is evidence of the Torah dating earlier or later, instead of getting into the game of trying to date the Torah, setting dating it aside, would you say that in general that the evidence doesn't help the case that the Torah could be dated earlier, without taking a specific side as to when it actually dates?
Okay, I like how you worded that question. So yes, my work does not help an early dating. I would say it also doesn't cancel out the possibility of an early dating. What my work shows is that that as far as actual practice, widespread knowledge of and practice of the Torah, there's no evidence until quite late, until the Hasmonean period. What does that say about the date of when the Torah was written down, edited, and so on and so forth? It really doesn't say a lot. It would allow for a late dating, right? Because if the conclusion was different, right? If there was widespread knowledge of and practice of the Torah already, just throwing out already in the year 600 BCE, then clearly the Torah was written and perhaps edited already at this time. We don't have that evidence. To the contrary, it only emerges in the Hasmonean period, which would then allow for a later dating of the Torah. But as you alluded to, I don't do that, and the reason I don't do that is because I simply haven't seen any good evidence for any kind of dating of the Torah. I haven't seen any good evidence either for an early dating or, quite frankly, for a late dating. None of what I've read to date from the oodles and oodles of scholarship that has come out from the 19th century until today, which has argued for various dates of the various Pentateuchal sources. I haven't found any of these particularly convincing. So, I don't have anything to contribute here, and I, quite frankly, don't find any of this very very convincing, and therefore very interesting. The question is an interesting one. I would love to know the answer to it, but I just haven't seen any data which is helpful for answering the question. There's a problem, I would just add, there's a problem in scholarship when scholars have a good question and they really want to know the answer. That's fine, right? There's nothing wrong with having a good question. That's good. And the desire to want an answer is also good. But that shouldn't lead us to coming up with all kinds of hypotheses and arguing for the various hypotheses when we don't have data that can answer these questions. So we need to recognize that a good question and a strong desire to want to answer that question shouldn't lead us to coming up with all kinds of garbage.
Vesper, thank you for your super chat. Which Hasmonean era finds support large-scale Torah purity, and what do they reveal about Essene and Mendayan practices?
Okay, so we have lots of finds from the Hasmonean period which suggest large-scale Torah. I'm not sure if you wanted to use the term purity or observance, but I can answer both. So we have, for example, coins from the Hasmonean period, which clearly lack figural art. Right? So the Hasmonean rulers are not including images of themselves or of animals or any humans on their coins, which is in deference to the second commandment. And in fact, it's not only on the coins, it's on art in general. This begins in the Hasmonean period and continues onward into the early Roman period. We have the emergence of ritual immersion pools getting up to purity. We have the emergence of stone vessels. So Judeans begin to make tableware and storage vessels out of chalk. And the reason they do this is because stone is not mentioned in the Torah amongst the list of various kinds of raw materials that of vessels that can become impure. So, for example, pottery that becomes impure, according to Leviticus 11, has to be broken. A stove, an oven that becomes impure has to be smashed. And then we have other materials, leather, wood, which has to be brought into water. Stone isn't mentioned, and because stone isn't mentioned, Judeans begin to produce vessels made out of stone. It's only Judeans that are doing this, nobody else. And this begins to emerge in the Hasmonean period. Like I said, immersion pools only appear amongst Judeans at Judean sites, and we find, we know over 1,000 of these immersion pools from the Hasmonean period and onward. All of this begins in the Hasmonean period, and we have other finds as well, depictions of the menorah, the seven-branched candelabrum from that we find in the book of Exodus that is supposed to be put into the tabernacle and later the temple. All of these finds begin to emerge in the Hasmonean period.
So now I want to ask you about the problem of using text, even when in the face of the lack of hard data to back it up. And when they look at the Torah and they come up with the documentary hypothesis, they'll come up with a zillion hypothetical documents. And what they're doing is they're building assumptions on top of assumptions about different centuries using hypothetical documents that we don't know exist. And on top of that, not having archaeological evidence to support the preconceived notions about what they think was the origins of Judaism. So my question to you is, what is the problem with that methodology?
Okay, so I don't want to get too far into the woods on critiquing higher criticism of biblical texts. I would say that there are good arguments to be made in this field. I'm not knocking the field of biblical scholarship. there are certainly good arguments to be made for relative dating of texts. So first, before we get to the dating, recognizing that one text is not written at the same time and by the same person as another text. I think that good arguments are certain have been made for such conclusions. In other words, I'll say that I have found many arguments put forward by biblical scholars of this sort to be compelling. So in other words, I can say that this text was not written by the same person at the same time as this text, and I can even say that this text was probably written first, and this text knew about this text. Okay, that these kinds of arguments I think are often compelling. The problem that I see, or the biggest problem that I see, is in terms of the attempt to absolutely date any of these texts. So to say, text A was written in the 8th century and text B was written in the 7th century, well, if you're going to say that, then you have to back that up with some kind of data, and that has to be compelling. And I have yet to see arguments of this sort to be compelling. So if that makes any sense, it's the relative um, relationship between two texts can often be strongly argued. But to say that either of these texts is dates to a specific period of time, I simply haven't found any of these arguments to be convincing. Of course, if we have a text that mentions Artaxerxes, that text was written at the time of Artaxerxes or later. There's a text that mentions Cyrus. That text was written at the time of Cyrus or later. But in order to say how much later, you're going to need to bring data to support your argument. And a text that lacks any reference to any historical event, and therefore I can't say that it must have occurred after that event, you're going to have to bring some kind of data to support your dating. You can't just say, throw out a year, 8th century, 7th century, 6th century, and expect us to accept that. I also don't accept arguments for a text sounding archaic, and therefore it must date to, and then you throw out a century. We can't work that way. We can't just throw out years and expect scholars to accept them because I don't know what. So those kinds of arguments I don't find compelling at all.
By which point do we absolutely know that, okay, but by this certain period, Yahweh's being worshipped as practically the only God or something close to that effect, and they've gotten rid of polytheism? By which point do we know that's actually happened?
Okay, so there are going to be scholars that are going to disagree with what I'm going to say here, because they're going to say that that's never happened, that until today, there's no such thing as monotheism. And within Judaism, they'll say you have, angels, and you have, when we get to, the Zohar and Kabbalah, we have all kinds of the Sfirot and all kinds of celestial beings together with Yahweh. Putting all of that aside, in terms of the kinds of things that we find in earlier periods, where we find what you mentioned, Yahweh and Vasherato, where we find Anat Yahu and Cherem Bethel and so on and so forth, other gods, other deities alongside Yahweh. That we don't find in the Hasmonean period and onward. We don't find multiple deities that are being worshipped by the Judeans. And I'm sure scholars will be able to come up with, random mentions of beings that they would, I guess, possibly think of as something, within the realm of the Judean God, but actual polytheism, actual uh, worship of or reverence for real deities, real gods, alongside Yahweh. I would say from the Hasmonean period, we don't see that. By the way, the reason that we don't see it from the Hasmonean period is because it says in the Torah that you're not supposed to do that. So that's something which it says very clearly in the Torah that you're not supposed to worship gods alongside Yahweh. So from the period that the Torah becomes widespread, the Torah becomes the law of the land. That's when this disappears. I think that's the reason that that makes sense.
So when you look at just to circle back to Ezra, so when you look at stories of Ezra bringing out some kind of law code at the request of at the order of Artaxerxes, do you see these stories as potentially attempting to backdate the Torah, creating a trail to lead back to Moses through Ezra, Hilkiah, and others, like in the letter of Aristeas? Do you think do you think these are different attempts to like create a trail leading back to Moses in the Mosaic attribution?
Perhaps something along those lines. I think that there were people who had this notion of a Mosaic Torah, going back, some time, and they told stories about Judeans, first learning about the Torah, the Torah suddenly coming upon the stage. Judeans not knowing about this thing, and then wow, okay, we just discovered this. Okay, we really should keep it. So we have that with Josiah, the story of Josiah. We have it with the story of Ezra, and it's interesting that it's a similar kind of story, right? It's a similar story where the Judeans completely knew nothing about the Torah, and then what? Somebody discovered this Torah, reads it before the people. We need to keep it. Again, the fact that the story is told doesn't mean that it happened, but the people that are writing this story wanted their readers to read this story. So this was an important story for them to tell. Why did they want to tell this story? I think because they wanted to convince their readers that the Torah is something that they should be keeping. And despite the fact that it's not well known, or it hadn't been well known, you need to recognize its authority, and you need to be keeping this Torah. I don't know when these stories were written. I don't know when the Josiah story was written. I don't know when the Ezra story was written. But regardless, its authors wanted the Judeans to be keeping the laws of the Torah. That doesn't mean that they were keeping the laws of the Torah, but they wanted them to. So I think I think the answer to your question is yes. This is what they wanted. This is what they were trying to do. They were trying to call for widespread observance of the Torah. That's what they were up to.
So now I want to bring up the Greek style architecture in this photo that you have here. And you mentioned now you have Eastern style lion sculpture, early to mid 2nd century BCE. And does this style of architecture continue into the 1st century BCE as well?
So I won't speak about the mixed style, but in terms of Greek style architecture, absolutely. So this is one of the earliest evidence we have for the use of Greek style architecture. And when I speak of Greek style architecture, I'm thinking of the famous Greek orders, the Doric, the Ionian, and the Corinthian. which we have in the Greek world centuries before this, but amongst Judeans, it only appears from the 2nd century BCE and onwards. And to your question, does it continue onward? The answer is yes. The temple in Jerusalem that Josephus describes, and the rabbis, by the way, is a Greco-Roman temple, right? It's, Josephus describes the royal stoa as being of the Corinthian order, and the stoa itself is a Roman structure. So this Greco-Roman architecture continues amongst Judeans in the Jerusalem temple itself. And again, the point here is that Greek culture, Greek architecture that we're talking about, is not in any way is not in conflict in any way with Judaism. You can build the Judean temple as a Greco-Roman temple. That's not a problem. It's no contradiction to the Torah as long as the God that's being worshipped there is the Judean God who's being worshipped according to the laws of the Torah, according to the laws that we find in Leviticus. So as long as we're following the laws of the Torah, the architecture, the language, the names, all of these things are in no way a problem. I would go further. We find Judaism adopting all kinds of Greco-Roman cultural artifacts, like, for example, the symposium, which is used as the model for what becomes the Passover meal, right? So the Passover meal, the way the rabbis describe it, is essentially a Greco-Roman symposium. So, and we find this with a lot of aspects. The synagogue itself that I described, this educational institution, I think to a certain degree is modeled on the gymnasium, right? We don't have an educational institution of any sort amongst the Judeans prior to this time. The Judeans took this notion of public education and adopted it for their own use for the promulgation of the Torah as the synagogue. This is essentially, I think a good argument could be made, this is essentially a Greek institution. But again, there's no reason to think that would have been a problem.
We have a super chat question from S. Mill. Thank you for your super chat. Is there any link between the writing of the Torah around the Hasmonean period and the finding of the book of the law in 2 Kings 22?
So to be clear, I am not arguing that the Torah was written around the Hasmonean period. I'm arguing that the Torah was adopted as the law of the land it seems to be under the Hasmoneans, and the stories that we find in Kings and in Chronicles as well about the discovery of the law. Again, I'm not arguing that this was written in the Hasmonean period either. These were stories that I think under the Hasmoneans probably became well known, and probably served the Hasmoneans' purposes by, again, having this notion of, okay, the Torah could be something which wasn't well known. It existed, it wasn't well known, and now it becomes well known under the aegis of a king. So there's something similar here. I think this certainly served the purposes of the Hasmoneans, if indeed my hypothesis is correct, that it was the Hasmoneans that adopted the Torah. This story would have served their purposes quite well, and also the story of Ezra, which again, as I said, is a similar story.
And for my final question, what are the problems with over-reliant on the text that could potentially lead to overreading without really considering the archaeological data and how that can conflict with texts?
So what I think is great about archaeology is that that when archaeological data is randomly sampled, when we find at sites throughout the country, we have when we excavate a site, we don't excavate the entire site, right? We excavate a small portion of the site. We can excavate an area here, an area there. We're essentially randomly sampling from a site, and we don't find everything that was there. We find what happens to have survived and what we happen to have excavated. Right? If I excavate, um, you know, uh, 2 meters down and not 3 meters down, I'm only going to find, what I've excavated, and I'm only going to find the things that are made of usually non-organic material that will survive. So it's very random what happens to survive. That randomness, I think, is good for giving us a window onto ordinary life. This is not something that was left over on purpose for me, the archaeologist, to find. Uh, that is good if we want to get a window onto what ordinary people are doing. That's archaeology. Texts were written for the express purpose of passing on information, of communicating information to the readers. And texts, by definition, are written by literate people. And literate people were, and we're not talking about only literate people, we're talking about literate people that were capable of writing texts of a high caliber. By definition, these people are a minority of the population. These are not, your ordinary farmers. These are not your ordinary, ordinary housewife that we would find in a marketplace in antiquity. So the archaeology gives us a window onto 99.999% of the population. Texts give us a window onto a very, very small portion of the population, and a very specific uh, 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 layer of that very small portion of the population. Now, the good thing about texts is that as an historian, there's a lot of data there, right? There's words, there's thoughts, there's so much in there. But the problem is when we take those texts and say to ourselves, well, this is what we have, so we'll just use this as a window onto what everyone was doing. Now, I want to be clear. It's not that the texts cannot be used for understanding what ordinary people were doing. They can. Any text that we have from a certain point in the past, the author was living in that period, right? The author was living in the period that within which he lived and wrote, obviously. So tautology. But he was a part of that society. So, he was wearing the clothing that other people was wearing. He was, using the modes of transportation that other people were using. He was speaking the language that other people were using. He was a part of that society. Usually, these ancient texts don't describe the ordinary people, but at least in between the lines, we can try to derive data about them. But in terms of of who wrote these texts, like I said, they're written by the creme de la creme of any society, and therefore they were written for a purpose. So these are all texts that have some kind of ideological / religious / political purpose for which they were written. A good historian knows how to look for that and to try to, like I said, read between the lines to try to get beyond that. But we always have to remember that that's what the texts are. And I've never argued that we should only use one or the other. We should only use archaeology or texts. To the contrary, texts give us one window onto ancient reality. Archaeology gives us another window, and what we're best advised to use all of the windows that we have. We're never going to have a panoramic view of the past. We're always only going to have these small apertures onto what was, and we're best advised to take all of these apertures, take all of these windows onto the past, and look through them and try to get as whole of a picture as we can get. We'll never have a whole picture, but as best we can, we should look at all of the data that we have, understand what that data is, and use that to try to piece together a picture.
So before we close, can you tell the audience when is your book coming out, and where can they go to purchase it?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I am hoping it will be within the next week or two. And when it does come out, it will, as far as I understand it, it's going to be coming out, by the way, with Cambridge University Press. As far as I understand, it will be coming out online at first. And from what I understand, it will be freely available for the first 2 weeks. So I will be posting about it on my X account, on my Facebook account. You can go to my academia.edu account. And if you're able to post it in the description of the video as well, when it does come out, I will be putting a link onto that on all of these sites. So follow me on all the sites. You'll get updates about the book and about my work in general.
In the meantime, if y'all want to, you can get a copy of The Origins of Judaism. The link to it will be in the description below in the pinned comment. And when Yonatan's latest book becomes available, the link will be added in the description below and in the pinned comment as well. That being said, Yonatan, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Jacob. It was a pleasure, as always.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.